Hello everyone, welcome to this week's episode. This week we're going to talk a little bit about the endpoint protection profile. Last week we did a little bit of a primer on co-management and how that works. So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about, one of the workloads that's inside of co-management, right? Device configuration. And in device configuration, we have a sub workload called endpoint protection. So what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about, what those workloads entail, and then talk about how they're different and how you can use them in your environment. So first, let's start at device configuration. All right, device configuration is the workload that encompasses all of device config in Intune. Okay, so when you move that slider over, remember last time we talked about Intune knowing the co-management state when the device checks in. So when the device checks in, it says, hey, I should get these workloads from Intune. Intune reads that value and then provides those workloads. So the top one here is device configuration. And device configuration gives you all of the device configuration profiles that are available in Intune. So it's just, hey, I used to get baselines and device config from Configuration Manager. When I go to move that over, now I get all of those from Intune. As you might imagine, device config on the Configuration Manager side is a pretty large set of objects, most notably baselines. So a lot of organizations don't want to immediately move device config because it requires some sort of change on the Configuration Manager side, whether it's inventorying your baselines or your configuration settings, whether it's mapping them over, whatever it is. The largest one that needs to be accomplished is usually going back through those baselines and figuring out which ones still need to apply, checking that box that says apply this baseline even if the device is co-managed. So that can be some work, but customers sometimes want to get the endpoint protection pieces from Intune, right? Things like Defender Antivirus, Defender for Endpoint, app control, whatever that's included in that workload. We'll get into that in a second. So we can move that endpoint protection workload over, and that endpoint protection workload just includes a subset of profiles, right? So if I move that over, I don't get all the device configuration profiles, just the ones that are encompassed in endpoint protection. The things that are encompassed in endpoint protection are here on the screen, but they're pretty self-explanatory. Pretty much anything inside of the endpoint security blade. There are some exceptions. You'll notice like device control isn't listed here, right? And baselines aren't listed here. But for the most part, it's anything that's in that endpoint protection profile underneath device config and endpoint security. Those other profiles, baselines and device control, are usually profiles in endpoint security that are comprised of multiple policies underneath the covers, and not all of those policies are endpoint protection policies. We'll get into more of that on another episode, I think, because we could talk a lot about that. But how does this really work, right? So, first, if you think I have two policies here, one policy that's a Defender Antivirus policy, right? And the other one that's a Hello for Business policy. Defender Antivirus is, of course, a endpoint protection policy. And you'll see here that on the policy type, it actually has metadata on the policy that says, hey, this is a device configuration profile, and this is an endpoint protection profile, right? There's different types of profiles it could be, like device compliance, for instance, but this is a device configuration profile, and it's an endpoint protection profile. You look at the Hello for Business profile that I have here, that profile is device config, of course, but also identity protection. So when you move that whole workload over, what happens here is the device says, hey, I have the device config workload going to Intune. Intune says, give me all policies that include policy type device config, and delivers those to the device. What ends up happening, though, if you just have endpoint protection moved over is, only that top Defender Antivirus policy matches because, when the check-in happens, our gateway says, hey, listen, give me all the policies that are endpoint protection policies to ship to the device. Only that top policy here that you see on the screen applies, and then that's shipped out to the endpoint, right? And this is essentially how that works at every check-in. So it's important to manage that configuration manager co-management state, like manage that state so you know what's happening and controlled. It's also how setting behavior can shift on check-in if you change your targeting for co-management, for instance, inside out of a collection. So it's important. The last thing that I'll say is when you move that endpoint protection or device configuration workload over to Intune, those endpoint protection settings that you may ship through in Intune or ship through in Configuration Manager, like AV, firewall, etc., those will stay on the device until the next check-in. So that way your device stays secure, right? So as soon as we see the policy come from Intune, that'll overwrite the policy that's coming from Configuration Manager. It's a short primer on endpoint protection. I'm over time as usual. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, reach out. We'll talk to you all later. Bye-bye.